Rick and Jeff, thank you very much. You certainly have fully introduced this panel. And in fact, in talking about IMA World Health, Rick, and in talking about Peace Appeal Foundations, you have begun the discussion, because those are the kinds of organizations that really address the issues precisely of the connections between human rights and religious communities. Jeff, you listed 3 questions that we were going to ask, and I've already assured my colleagues I'm not going to ask them those questions in that form. But I think it is...
I cannot hear you well. Somehow the sound is different.
It's echoing.
Well, I have no control over that, so maybe this gentleman can... I will try not to have my voice tremor, but I can't control it. Well, then we might as well turn this one off, right? Okay, I'm sorry if the echoing was distracting. Jeff mentioned 3 points. I was just going to very quickly say them again, because they're not questions we're going to answer as such, but they're kind of a frame of reference for the rest of our discussion, and certainly we can pursue them in more detail in questions afterward. But the 3 points are, it strikes me as interesting, namely, first, that arguably religion or religious traditions globally are one of the major sources for the whole idea of human rights. That's the good news. Secondly, that it's very clear in recent decades that religion is a very important dimension of the abuses of human rights that have taken place. That's the less good news. And then thirdly, there is a kind of built-in tension, in my view, between human rights, which has as its default worldview kind of Western individualism, and religious traditions worldwide, which tend to emphasize community more than human rights, the human rights movement does. So those are background questions that we can come back to explicitly, but I thought it would be good if we started first and gave Karen and Eileen a chance to tell us a little more directly and personally about the ways in which law and the study of religion have interacted in their own professional development and their own careers. As you heard from the very detailed introductions, Karen studied the law before she came to Divinity School, and Eileen studied law after she was here. And they're both involved in professions which clearly integrate legal education and concern for religion very closely. But I think it would be at least instructive for me to hear a little bit more about how that works. And they were pointing at each other as to who goes first. But I think that as the one who studied law before coming here, I think Karen will give you. Would you really rather have Eileen go first?
It's totally up to you.
Yes.
Okay, Eileen, you're resilient. So tell us a little bit about how law and religion interact. You might mention even your thesis, which clearly deals directly with the question of law and morality.
Yeah. So let me start on a more personal note, which is I sat down with Dean Hempton this morning, and I was recounting that I had planned to go to law school. I'd graduated from college. I spent a year in China, and I think I was really overwhelmed to see the relationship between citizens and the government there. This was 1981, so people were still in Mao suits, and I had a cadre following me around, and it was a different time. And I just was awakened to the big questions about the relationship of citizens and governments. And I had intended to go to law school, and I realized it was going deeper for me. Those questions were really about how society is organized and values questions, and that's how I ended up here. But I will say that when I left here and then applied to law school, the questions about relationship between government and citizens I've carried with me from those days on throughout my career and in everything I've done. And I would say right now, my work as a human rights advocate very much is framed around that relationship. So that even though there's an individualism at the heart of the human rights movement, in many ways, the biggest question that the human rights movement asks is how do governments get to treat their citizens? So that is carried throughout. And I think also questions of truth, which I know, your work touches on, and due process and all of those things, again, get at the relationship. How can a government treat its citizens at the end of the day? Last thing I will touch on, because you mentioned in my PhD dissertation, I worked on questions about conflicting legal and ethical justifications for humanitarian military intervention. So cases like Rwanda, when nobody intervened, or cases like Kosovo, when there was an international intervention that wasn't authorized by the Security Council and therefore was technically illegal, but actually stopped, a bloodbath. All those kinds of cases. When is it justified? When is it not justified? When is it legal? And when is it not legal? Sometimes in tension. At the root of that I found, was really natural law questions. Just war theory being based on natural law theory, which you could say starts with Aristotle, but runs right through Thomas Aquinas, and comes very much to the fore in the contemporary human rights movement, even though it is not always acknowledged. So for me, there's a real religious root there in the impetus to intervene for humanitarian purposes.
Well, let me just stay, Karen, we'll get to you in a second, but stay with that just a little further, because it's, except for that last comment, natural law, morality as a function in your dissertation, I hear in most of what you said an extremely high salience and relevance of law to what you're doing. I hear a very much more attenuated emphasis on or reference to the role that religion plays. And could you tell, if you had to pick out the 2 or 3 ways of accentuating the contribution of your study of religion to that profession, what would those look like?
I would say it's less intellectual and more emotional, personal, values-oriented. So it is the personal sense that care for others, service to others, and justice for others. I don't know that I could link it back intellectually and to religious roots, but I would say the animating energy comes from a place that is spiritual or religious as a dynamic.
Well, given the level of energy you have, that must be very powerful.
It's strong.
Karen, you studied law, were a practicing attorney, and then came here. Tell us a little about that story.
Okay, and first I want to say that I often say that before I went to Divinity School, I was terrified of public speaking, but now I'm fine, but I still am. I have to drink lots of coffee before I can speak publicly, which I have to do. For me, though, I actually deferred admission to Harvard Divinity School in 1986. And I didn't come until 1997. So it was kind of a long time. And in 1986, I felt really, I was sort of caught between, do I do something that's really, really practical in order to look for justice and bring justice? But I really felt that it was the spiritual basis for transformation. But I went to work in some refugee camps, and at that time, I realized, no, I have to do something really concrete. So I did the thing which I thought was not really me, but I went to law school in order to do it. And then I spent a number of years as a public defender and also worked in Cambodia, training the first group of public defenders. And I thought to myself finally, because I always wanted to go to Divinity School, I thought, oh my gosh, I finally get to go to Divinity School. And now I can just relax and not have to deal with the law anymore. And what happened for me, though, is that in the course of it, I kept coming back to this thing that was sort of undone. I started International Bridges of Justice because I recognize the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are being tortured every single day. And they're tortured because they are really too poor to afford an attorney, and it's the cheapest form of investigation. And this awareness came to me in 1994 when I was working in Cambodia and walked into a prison one day, and I saw a 12-year-old boy who was tortured and denied access to counsel, but no one would help him. And I realized at that moment that the irony of the situation is that the Cambodian government was like, if you want to help him, go ahead. But nobody would help him because he wasn't an important political prisoner who did good for anybody. He was a 12-year-old boy who stole a bicycle. And I recognized that there was a huge gap in the system and was working at it sort of methodologically in that way. But then I thought, okay, after 3 years of working in Cambodia, I finally came to Divinity School, and I thought, that's great. I did what I could do, and now I get to go to Divinity School. But it still bothered me. It still bothered me because I realized, oh my gosh, it's not just Cambodia, we're not finished. It's all over the world that people are being tortured, and the world is not responding to it. And so what happened for me in that transformation was that I began to understand for myself, really, that it wasn't going to happen, that we as human beings co-create history. And I kept, even with my field educations, I went and did one trying to write a legal needs assessment for Vietnam and different countries and China, and I kept thinking and trying to convince other organizations and the UN that I'd worked for to do this, like, let's take it on because we can do this in our lifetime. We can end torture as an investigative tool, but it couldn't be done. And so finally I realized that I was going to do it, and I thought this was the deal that I made with God. I'm going to do it for 1 year. I'm going to do it for 1 year, set up this perfect organization, and then it's going to be the dream job for someone, and someone else is going to take it over. But it never became the dream job for anybody. And so 12 years later, in 2012, I renegotiated it for another 12 years. And that was sort of the genesis. I'm a very good negotiator, or a very bad one, I'm not sure.
You're now a Unitarian, an ordained Unitarian minister. When you came to the Divinity School, were you also a Unitarian, or was that
I wasn't Unitarian.
So tell us a little about that pilgrimage.
You know, it was really...
If Unitarians will allow the use of the word pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage. You know, it was really strange because everyone always says, why did you go to Divinity School? And the only thing that I could think about is, do you know this movie, The Terminator? Remember The Terminator? It was the only way I could describe it. But, you know, he loses consciousness and then he opens his computer and it says, go to or get yourself to. And that was what it was for me. It was like, get yourself to Divinity School. And I couldn't understand why. I mean, I really could not. The first Sunday I was here, I woke up in the dorms and I was like, where is everybody? And I was like, oh, they're in church. but I didn't understand that. And so I didn't know what it was, except I felt this, you know, it was exactly like when I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger, I go, that's what's happening to me. For 12 years, it was like, get yourself to Divinity School. It's like, why? Get yourself to Divinity School. So I came, and I don't know, somehow I became a Unitarian person.
And does that connection with the UUA inform International Bridges to Justice or your work there?
It does, and I'd say even more so than that, it's the training. And, you know, I sort of have my secret stash of what really happens in our trainings. And many people often say, oh my gosh, they're so transformational, we don't understand. Why? I mean, so-and-so's done a legal training, so-and-so's done a legal training. Why are yours different? Why do the lawyers stand up afterwards and say, we will defend every person in prison, we will form a movement? And it's because I have my secret Unitarian Universalist books. And you know what, they're actually, my favorite book is a youth book. And I used to have it and would bring it to China. It's got all the poems for youth. It's got it's called On Your Path. But what I realized that as I was working with the lawyers and the judges and the prosecutors, you know, in reality, what they're looking for is they're looking for their own values clarification. Like, if you're going to talk to police about not torturing, it's not about telling them, which is what I learned as a lawyer, don't torture, it's wrong, these are the laws. It's about taking a step backwards and saying, well, what are your values? why did you become a police officer? And when they say, I became a police officer because I want to end torture, then you say, okay, but you're torturing. And as they connect to their values, it's what transforms. So a lot of it for me is that it is sort of the food which allows me to be able to do the work that we do. And I think the Unitarian Universalist part is also the explicit embracing of all of the different faith traditions of people that we work with. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but when we hire our defenders, we don't do a faith test, like, what is your religion or anything. But a few years ago, when we brought together the lawyers, I realized that when our Cambodian head came, he's a Buddhist monk, and he was like, okay, we're going to pray because he was a Buddhist monk for 14 years. And it was the same thing with Innocent from Zimbabwe, because he preaches as a born-again Christian every Sunday that actually they do bring their faith traditions, and that is what allows them to build their own movements in their countries.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe we can turn back to you for a minute, Eileen. You've been in a number of really very interesting settings for looking at the whole set of issues connected with human rights. And you, in your position in Geneva for the UN, you obviously always also had to be cognizant of the way in which human rights and religion were connected in the U.S. foreign policy, so in the State Department. And now in Human Rights Watch, you have another perspective. So say a little about those different settings and the way in which the issue of human rights and its connection to religious communities takes shape.
First comment I want to make, just picking up on something Karen just said about speaking to police officers and getting them to step back and instead of telling them this is right or this is wrong and this is what the law tells you, but to get them to reflect on their own values. Completely parallel situation that I had in Geneva as a diplomat in finding ways to convince other diplomats from around the world that they should join an initiative. It could be, one particular example was freedom of assembly and association, where we would look the ambassador from Argentina in the eye and say, what about the mothers of the disappeared? If they hadn't had the right to protest and get out there, that would have never been changed. Or in Poland, the solidarity movement. And we would touch on, or in South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, if they didn't have the right to assemble and associate, then those societies would not have been transformed. And so in each of those cases, you could see the light in the eye, that the diplomats would say, yes, that's our value. We own that. That's not being imposed on us. That's not an American value. It's not a Western value. It's ours. And so there's such resonance in that idea of getting people to step back and claim their values. And people are animated by things other than the intellect. At the end of the day, truth can only be told on some level in ways that are different than linear analytic thinking. And whether it's literature or spiritual or mysticism, that's where truth is. And that's what really animates people around the world. So that's my first comment about the role of religion in a positive sense. Not articulable necessarily, but you connect with people in an inarticulate way through examples and stories. On the subject of religion in Geneva, I will say I have to admit there were a lot of ways in which religion played a negative role. In that, a good example there is the LGBT issue, where in many cultures, particularly in the African continent, people would stand up in the room, the Palais des Nations, room 20, where we did our work, and feel very certain that they were standing up for truth and justice by not supporting LGBT rights. And the conflict there was remarkable. The clash of values was just palpable. And yet, I look at our own country and see the movement on that particular issue, and I watched our leadership in the short time I was there. I watched Secretary Clinton move on that issue dramatically, to the point where she's out there, leading and giving a global speech on LGBT rights that she couldn't have thought about 2.5 years earlier. So there's movement happens, and there's a danger of religious certainty, fanaticism, fundamentalism, that can be dangerous to human rights. But as I say, I generally see it as an animating values proposition.
Okay, Karen, what about you? Do you see the role of religion in being positive in the development of human rights as you've experienced it?
We've definitely experienced it as being the primary force, which has allowed us to really move forward. And we've seen that with our defenders. And I see that also as the only way possible, because they are really making the seemingly impossible possible. And it's through their faith, and whatever faith it is, that they're saying, okay, we can keep going, we can keep going. So I see it individually with each individual country, even though they're different faiths that they're grounded in, and when they come together, they even come to conversations about, oh yeah, I'm leading my church in this, or I'm doing it in a different way, but it motivates the individuals. But also, with International Bridges to Justice right now, we recently brought together we brought together some Japanese Buddhist monks, a rabbi, a cardinal from Nigeria, 3 Muslim leaders, and we all came together and talked about why we need to prioritize the end of investigative torture. And the reason that I first came to understand this, even for myself, in terms of saying, hey, why aren't we doing this, is that it was about a year ago, sitting in church on Good Friday and saying, okay, Jesus Christ is nailed to the cross. It's an innocent man. He had no lawyer, and we're sad about it. But there's so many people today who are being tortured, and they don't have a lawyer. And we can do something about these people. And why, I thought, as I sat in church, aren't we doing something about it? So I talked to some of the people, and they said, yeah, let's do something. And then I started talking to my Buddhist friends, and they're saying, every single person said, it's in our tradition as well. It's in our tradition. And we don't want to be left behind as you begin to build a coalition for it. So definitely faith and the interfaith movement is something that we really hope is going to make this happen in our lifetime.
Well, thank you both very much for that. As we turn to questions from the audience, I would like to underscore how relatively new the developments are that you're describing. If we go back a couple of decades, the human rights movement was animated by secular individualistic concerns. It was antagonistic to religion, saw religion as a problem, not as part of the solution. And you've described changes in the last handful of years that are really quite dramatic from what the circumstances were even just, say 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so it's a very interesting testimony to the way in which the relationship between religion and any number of social issues, not just human rights, but any number of issues. There are new opportunities, new possibilities now that we have not been accustomed to in recent decades. Well, thank you very much. Let's see what kinds of questions there are from the audience. Yes.
Both of you resonated, I think, with the idea that asking people, parties to a dispute, to connect to their own values is a way to get them to see things alike and to come together and be motivated to do something. But you've also admitted that sometimes those values don't coincide, and so when asked to connect with their values, they end up still in conflict, or maybe in new forms of conflict. So I'm wondering if you have more to say about how you negotiate that. Is it just a pragmatic matter, or is there some critical thinking that becomes involved in assessing values when they don't coincide, that sort of thing.
Well, I'm called a Pollyanna, probably for good reason. And I basically, and I hear it all the time from different, well, you know, that group does this, or we do this, or we also, and you know what, it's like, I don't care. I want you to find me the good thing that we can connect to. And that's true. We started that with the laws, and they'll say, there's 5 laws here that allow us to beat people up, and that's the prosecutor to catch us on that. I'm like, find me the 5 good things, and we will stand up in court every day and argue those things. And I think it's the same thing, too, in terms of faith and religion and values. That even when that discourse comes in sometimes, and it's like, well, you know, they believe this, or we believe this. Maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but I'm like, you know what? I don't care. Find me the 5 good things, and let's go in and let's work with that, and let's make that light grow bigger. And every tradition has always said, yes, we want to stand with you because we don't like the fact that people say we do this and this. So let's stand together in that way.
I could add, first of all, I love Pollyannas.
Thank you.
That approach completely resonates in terms of my experience as a diplomat, which is when big conflicts are there and it's seemingly irreconcilable, start small and find something on which there is a basis for agreement. And it's remarkable how often that can work. And it just came to mind that one of the biggest decade-long conflicts that had existed at the Commission on Human Rights, which was the predecessor organization to the Council and the Council on Human Rights, was this conflict over the Islamic approach to defamation of religion versus the Western approach to freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression, just irreconcilable conflict. And we ended up just everybody storming out of rooms over, year after year, and then finally locking ourselves in a room. The Pakistani ambassador, and we were there, the U.S. was there, and some in the EU were there, and we basically cut it down to the core, stripped down kernel of what we could agree on, and that served as the basis that has been built upon year after year. So just as a tactic, there's a reality to, if you find something you agree on, maybe you can build upon it.
I guess I'd add one further comment that goes very much along the same lines. It seems to me critically important that human rights advocates try very hard to understand how what we're saying about human rights is heard in settings that hadn't indigenously produced this kind of language. And I say that not because it means any and every approach is equally good, but the basis on which criticism can be made of any cultural tradition, including Western ones, is first to understand it more or less in its own terms, and then critique becomes possible. And I think unless that kind of empathy is practiced, there really is no chance of getting to the point where positions are not just at loggerheads. And Eileen, I would take it that's really what you were just describing, has happened in that diplomatic dance.
Exactly right.
Yes, Connie. They're going to come with a microphone, and I tell you, they really hustle around here to keep.
I wonder if you would comment on what I hope is a growing awareness of the large U.S. prison population and human rights in relationship to that population, and how that, plus a notion that seems to be totally ingrained in our culture about the deserving and undeserving, and how do you put together the human rights dimensions for that population and justice, and the trying to put forth deserving and undeserving and what they mean in terms of religion. Simple question.
Karen, I think we should start with you on that.
Well, we don't work in the United States from the perspective that we work to organize people in the United States who would support defenders in other developing countries, because our focus is ending torture as an investigative tool, not for political reasons, but just because there's no lawyer there. However, the question of the deserving versus undeserving is huge for us. And that, I think, is at the crux of why it's been so difficult for us to end torture as an investigative tool. I mean, when I first started in the year 2000, everyone was like, are you crazy? And every funder that I went to said, you know what? I'm not gonna, why should I help these people? You know, they might have killed someone, they might have done this, they might have done that. And at the time, I didn't have that great of an answer, except for the fact that, you know, I want to help them anyway. I still think they shouldn't be tortured. But today, 14 years later, when I have seen children who have been tortured, when I've seen women who haven't done anything, when I've seen men over and over and over again who are imprisoned and tortured purely because they're the poorest of the poor and do not have a lawyer to defend them, I can say they are the deserving. And I think it's that dichotomy of the deserving versus the undeserving, which hurts all of us in society because we won't take care of everyone.
I can add specifically on the U.S. dimension, which is to say that U.S. policy on criminal justice issues generally, death penalty especially, the number of people who are incarcerated, the populations who are incarcerated, is a sheer embarrassment for us internationally, and we are outliers to such an extent. Everybody in this room, if you're not aware of it, you would be shocked and appalled at the extent to which the U.S. is an outlier globally. So just on the death penalty itself, which has so many issues, even if you think the death penalty is okay, the way we impose it and the racial bias, and there's so many different aspects to it. No due process, there's only, we are one of the top 5. I think it's Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, China, and the U.S. Top, implementers of the death penalty. And everywhere else in the world, people just scratch their heads. They don't understand how we could stand up and defend our practices. And I think there should be a real movement. This is one of the bases upon which we get criticized globally, and we should all be embarrassed about it.
Well, I would like to echo that, and I would suggest that Karen, in your second 12-year term now,
Ends in 2020.
it is, your organization is called International Bridges to Justice, or for Justice, and in principle, international canon should include the U.S. And it does seem to me that even from the point of view of torture as an investigative tool, the United States has a horrifically bad record. And just look at the convictions that are based entirely on coerced confessions that turn out to be untrue in the end. Whether that's torture or not, it's pretty close in order to get a coerced confession. So as you move into this next decade of your time at Bridges to International Justice, I think trying to simulate the UUA or some other organization to really have a similar spotlight on American practices would be very salutary.
And the UUA is now supporting us in looking at, especially at building the Interfaith Coalition to end torture as an investigative tool. They're looking at partnering congregations right now with individual justice makers that we have in the countries to support them and really, give voice to their work.
Good. Well, right front and center.
Thank you. Both of you have spoken about your work at a very interpersonal community level. So either working in a community of diplomats or working with a community individuals in a jail. Wondering if you could each speak about the challenges and relationships with institutions, either political institutions or religious institutions in your work, and the challenges and benefits that you've received from those relationships.
Well, unless you have something else in mind, the thing that immediately comes to my mind from my experience as a diplomat was being part of the US government, if that's what you mean. I mean, from being part of a large bureaucracy and watching it move toward decision or not, and the sausage making and the thinking processes, it was pretty stunning to me as a person and someone who's driven to achieve human rights results. It was really challenging at times to wring answers out of an organization that didn't always have the wheels turning very fast. So that's my initial reaction.
Okay, so I hope you don't get me in trouble, because I'm trying to think about how to do this as diplomatically as possible. And if I lose all funding everywhere, I'm going to come to you and ask you to help us to support this. In terms of institutions, I mean, I will say that I think as a world community, we have failed in our potential for what we can do. I mean, it is absolutely outrageous. The fact that there are 113 countries that torture, but 93 have all passed laws. And these countries are asking for support in order to have lawyers so that people are not tortured. But we ignore it as a world community because we prefer to punish. I mean, that is our preference. It is justice. It is getting up on justice. And so, for instance, in Cambodia, this is about institutions because it's an institutional choice. The majority are institutional choices that we make for money. In Cambodia, we spent over $100 million last year, to prosecute one guy who unfortunately died before we got to justice. I might not have a problem with spending $100 million, but when you think about it, International Bridges to Justice has 9 defender resource centers in 9 provinces. It's $30,000 per resource center. In those provinces, you are guaranteed a lawyer, and torture is an exception, not the rule. But there's another 8 provinces that don't have defenders. But when you look at the fact that the international community chooses instead to say, we will put our money in prosecution because it makes us feel really good. And that I think is a problem with human rights institutionally. It makes us feel really good to prosecute. Well, we can prosecute, but we also have to spend resources in building the future for things. So institutionally, I think that it's a problem. I think it's a worldwide problem that we choose to stay the status quo, and that we keep having these conferences that say, how can we improve the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It's like, okay, in 1948 we decided you should have right to a lawyer, right not to be tortured. And guess what? We're going to talk about how to improve it. That's great, but can we just take some money and implement those things right now so we could stop people from being tortured? So I think some of the issues with institutions is that there is a bias in human rights that goes in one direction from a specific paradigm of what human rights is. And to me, a lot of times, it's not necessarily all about love and transformation. It's also about righteousness, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes just to be righteous is really not enough.
Yes.
Are there, in your experience, any new alternative models to torture?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the U.S. and many places, instead of torture, you investigate. You do different things. That's in the United States. If you get picked up, you get a lawyer, and then you can investigate in different ways. And so, in many of these countries, it really is that it's the cheapest form of investigation. So they'll say, when I negotiate with ministers of justice, even ministers of justices in countries that many people don't like, they'll say straight up, even Zimbabwe, okay, people are being tortured, but if you want to put public defenders here and work with our police, go ahead, because they're just everyday people who are being tortured. So it really is a system of early access to counsel that protects people. It gives them the same level of protection as if they were someone who's middle class or upper class. And that's what we're trying to do, to provide people who don't have the resources with just the same protection that's provided by law.
Okay, let's go one last question back there, and then because we have to make our way across to the reception and dinner.
Thank you for the last question. So my question is fairly straightforward to you as activists. As an institution, what advice, or do you have advice that you might give to Harvard Divinity School about how we here as an educational institution might, better support in whatever kind of way you can imagine for us.
Why don't you start?
Well, I do think that the question goes to the core of contributions that Harvard Divinity School indeed can make, and I would venture to say has made over the decades, namely to prepare people who have got a kind of cross-cultural sensitivity to what the human rights community has called attention to, although from, in my view, a quite provincial Western perspective rather than a more global one. And I think that Harvard Divinity School can continue to play that very important role by having kind of comparative studies and ethical emphasis that it has had historically, by working in consort with the law school on program development and a host of other ways. And I would urge the Divinity School to keep on keeping on those various fronts.
So I have something to add, which is to encourage the institution to convince your students that yes, you can do it, just like Karen has. I mean, I heard this morning you said you came here and you realized, yes, I can do this, create this organization. And sort of stop and recognize there really is no one else. You really have to come to that moment and realize that no one else is going to step up to the plate. And you can't stand back just because you think you don't know enough or you haven't thought it all through, or at the end of the day, it is you. It is you. And when you're commenting on the fact that the standards are there, but they're not, why aren't people outraged? You need people out there to put it in everyone's face and remind everyone there should be outrage at the extent to which torture still happens. And the students here should be feeling, I'm the one. I'm the one who has to do it, just like you felt.
Well, I don't know if someone else is to end this session, or am I supposed to end this? Okay.
Thank you all very much. I want to just ask if we could give a hand to our panel here, the panel from this afternoon.